Okay, so recently we were looking at Newton's laws of motion, where we talked about the first law of motion, Newton's second law of motion, and as well as Newton's third law of motion. And then also talked about something called resultant force, how to calculate the resultant force. So in this video here, in the first question, we want to know how we can get the resultant force. How do we get the resultant force? Now, to get the resultant force here, we are just going to compare the two forces that are acting on this body. So we've got these two forces, 15 Newton force acting in this direction, and then we have a 6 Newton force acting in the opposite direction. Now the question is asking us to find the resultant force. So how do we find the resultant force? Now to find the resultant force, we just subtract the forces that we have. So we are going to say that the resultant force RF will be equal to, which one is the bigger force? 15. So we're saying 15 newtons minus the smaller force, which is 6 newtons. Okay? And so the final answer here, the resultant force, when we say 15 minus 6, we are getting 9 newtons. So it means that this body that has got a mass of 10 kg, we will move to the left. Okay, it will move to the left with a force of 9 newtons. Now question B, in question B we want to calculate the acceleration with which this body will move at. Okay, so how do we get the acceleration? Now from Newton's second law of motion, we discussed that force equals mass times acceleration. Now, what is the force? The force that we're going to use here is this resultant force. So we're going to put 9 here equals, the mass is 10. You must always ensure that the mass is in kgs. So if this mass was in grams, we would have had to convert to kilograms. Okay, so the mass is 10 times the acceleration. So 10 times A, we get 10A equals 9. And then from here, we're going to divide both sides by 10 like that. Now, when we divide by 10, I'm sure you are able to see that the acceleration will be equal to 0.9 meters per second squared, like that. This will be the answer. All right? That will be the acceleration. Now, what if we had something like this? Let's say we had this body here. We have this body, okay? Now we are assuming this body has got a mass of 25, let's say 25 grams, and then this is just the ground. This is the ground. Now, over here we've got force 1, which is 9 newtons. We have another force, which is 6 newtons. And then in the opposite direction, let's have 5 newtons. The first question is asking us to calculate the resultant force. How do we get the resultant force? Now, I think I sent something like this to the group. So, to get the resultant force here, when you have this body, and then you've got 3 forces acting on this body. These 2 forces here are acting in the same direction. So because they are acting in the same direction, we are going to add them. So we are going to say the resultant force will be equal to 9 plus 6 newtons minus this smaller force here that is acting in the opposite direction with them. So minus 5. So 9 plus 6 is 15, right? So 9 plus 6, we are getting 15 minus 5. So the resultant force will be 10 newtons. So 10 newtons is going to be the resultant force. So this body here, this body of mass 25 grams, we will move to the right with a force of 10 newtons. Question B, we want to calculate the acceleration with which this body will move at. So how do we get the acceleration? Now recall that force equals mass times acceleration. The force, we always get the resultant, which is 10 in this case. The mass, I said the mass should always be in grams, in kilograms, sorry. So because this mass is in grams, it has to be changed to kilograms. So by now you must know how to convert from grams to kilograms. I taught you. We say that the mass, we're just going to say 25 grams divided by 1000. To change from grams to kilograms, you just divide by 1000. So the mass will be equal to 0.025. 0.025 kgs. This is the mass. So this mass, we are going to put it here, 0.025 times the acceleration. So 0.025 times acceleration, we are getting 0.025 acceleration equals 10. Now when we say 10, we divide both sides by 0.025. So we say over 0.025. This side as well over 0.025. This one goes. The acceleration will be equal to 1 meter per second squared, like that. This will be the acceleration. This will be the acceleration. Okay? Now, we talked about types of forces, where we talked about friction being a type of a force. Now, what is friction? Friction is the force that opposes the motion of two touching surfaces, all right? When you are pulling something, say for example, you are pulling a desk, the desk will make noise, okay, together with the floor, to make noise. Now, what is causing it to make noise is friction. Friction always acts in the opposite direction, all right? So, let's say for example, let's have this body here. Let's say we have this body. We have this body here. Okay? Now let's have a force of 10 newtons acting in this direction. This is the ground. Now let's assume that they've given us that the value of friction is 6 newtons, and that the mass of this body here is 5 kilograms. What is the resultant force? So this side, there is no opposing force that you can know, that you can see. Okay? But then because we've been given that the value of friction is 6 newtons, we are assuming that there's 6 acting in the opposite direction. Okay? There's 6 that is acting in the opposite direction. So the resultant force will be equal to 10 newtons minus the value of friction, 6 newtons. So the resultant force will be equal to 4 newtons. So it will move with the force of 4 newtons to the right. What is the acceleration? Remember, force equals mass times acceleration. The force is 4 newtons. The mass, is 5 multiplied by the acceleration. So 5 times acceleration, we are saying it is 5a equals 4. Divide both sides by 5. This and that goes. So the acceleration now, the acceleration will be equal to what? The acceleration will be equal to 0.8 meters per second squared, like that. This will be the answer. Alright guys, see you in the night. Hope you've understood 1 or 2 things. Bye bye. Also, don't forget to subscribe.